Blake Lively's ongoing legal dispute with Justin Baldoni is already under intense scrutiny.
That's why. So it was 2010 in Paris. Like they were shooting like I think it was two episodes like of Gossip Girl season 4 in Paris.
But now, a past account from a former Gossip Girl crew member is adding a new layer to the conversation. As the case continues to unfold, a production assistant who worked on the set back in 2010 has come forward again, describing what he says was a noticeably different experience working with Lively compared to others on set. And while the claims themselves are not new, the timing is what's drawing attention. Because this isn't happening in isolation. It's happening while questions are already being raised about credibility, evidence, and conflicting narratives in the current legal dispute. And that raises a broader question. When past behavior starts to resurface during an act of controversy, does it change how the present situation is viewed? That's what we're going to break down step by step. And if you want to stay updated as this develops, you can subscribe. I'll continue covering the key updates as they come in. What makes this situation notable isn't just the resurfacing of an old account, it's when it's resurfacing. The legal dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni has already introduced a complex set of claims, responses, and reported evidence. According to public discussions around the case, Baldoni has presented materials such as messages and other documentation intended to challenge the narrative being presented. At the same time, Lively's claims remain part of an ongoing legal process, where final determinations have not yet been made. So the public conversation has already shifted from a single narrative to something more contested. And it's within that environment that older accounts are starting to gain new attention. Because when a case is still unfolding, anything that appears to add context, even something from years earlier, tends to be reevaluated through a different lens. In this case, the resurfacing account comes from someone who worked on the Gossip Girl set during a brief period of filming in Paris. At the time, the experience didn't become widely known or discussed. But now, with Blake Lively's name tied to an active legal dispute, that same account is being revisited, not as a standalone story, but as something potentially connected to a broader pattern. And that's where the tension begins to build. Because the question isn't just what happened back then. It's whether past experiences, especially those involving workplace dynamics, should influence how current claims are interpreted. And before getting into the details of that account, it's important to understand exactly who is speaking out, and why their perspective is now being brought back into focus. The account itself comes from a former production assistant, known as Ewood, who worked briefly on the Gossip Girl set during filming in Paris in 2010. At the time, this was described as his first major experience working on a large-scale production. His role placed him at the lower end of the production hierarchy, assisting with logistics, supporting crew operations, and interacting with cast members in a limited but direct capacity. And according to his account, that environment made certain interactions more noticeable. Ewood describes a contrast between how different cast members engaged with the crew. In particular, he points to what he perceived as a clear difference between Blake Lively and co-star Leighton Meester. He claims that while Meester was consistently respectful and acknowledged crew members regardless of their role, his interactions with Lively felt markedly different. According to his description, there were moments where basic greetings were not acknowledged, and a broader sense of distance or dismissiveness was present. But more notably, he characterizes the behavior as something less overt, not openly confrontational, but what he describes as passive-aggressive. He suggests that certain actions, including what he interpreted as mocking or dismissive remarks toward lower-level staff, contributed to an uncomfortable working environment. Importantly, these are personal accounts based on a limited time frame and perspective, and they are not independently verified findings. However, what gives them renewed attention now is not just the content of the claims, but how they are being interpreted in the context of current events. Because this isn't simply about a past on-set experience anymore. It's about how that experience is being viewed alongside an ongoing legal dispute, and whether it introduces a second layer of tension that wasn't part of the original narrative. What adds another layer to this account is not just the behavior being described, but the contrast being drawn. Because in Ewood's recollection, the difference wasn't subtle. It was, in his view, consistent. He describes Leighton Meester as maintaining a neutral, professional approach across all interactions, regardless of someone's role on set. That kind of consistency, especially in high-pressure production environments, tends to stand out, particularly to someone experiencing that environment for the first time. And that contrast becomes important, because it shifts the focus from a single isolated interaction to a broader question about workplace dynamics. If one individual is perceived as treating all crew members equally, while another is described as interacting differently depending on status, it introduces the idea of a possible pattern, or at least a perceived imbalance. At the same time, the nature of these claims makes them difficult to evaluate definitively. Ewood himself describes the behavior as subtle, not something that would necessarily be captured on record or easily proven. He characterizes it as passive-aggressive, suggesting that while the actions may not appear significant in isolation, the overall environment they created felt different. And that distinction matters, because in many workplace scenarios, especially in entertainment production, dynamics are often shaped not by overt incidents, but by repeated smaller interactions that accumulate over time. However, it's also important to recognize the limitations here. This account reflects one individual's perspective during a specific period of time. It does not represent a formal finding, nor does it establish a broader conclusion on its own. But in the context of an ongoing legal dispute, where credibility and behavior are already under discussion, even a single account like this can begin to carry more weight in the public conversation. And that's where the narrative starts to shift, because the focus is no longer just on what is being alleged in the present, but how past experiences may be interpreted alongside it. As this account began circulating again, what changed wasn't just awareness, it was interpretation. Because when the legal dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni first became public, much of the initial reaction followed a familiar pattern. Early narratives often lean toward one side, especially when claims are serious and information is still limited. And according to discussions around the case, that appeared to be the starting point here. But as more details reportedly emerged, including materials released by Baldoni's side, the conversation began to shift. Instead of a single dominant narrative, the situation became more layered, with different interpretations developing in parallel. And that shift is where past accounts like Ewood's start to take on a different role. Not as definitive proof of anything, but as additional context that some viewers begin to factor into how they evaluate the situation. Ewood himself describes going through a similar shift in perspective. Initially, he indicates that he approached the situation with an open mind, emphasizing that if any allegations were true, they should be taken seriously. But as more information became publicly discussed, he says he began to question whether the full picture was being represented. And that progression from neutral observation to skepticism mirrors what often happens in high-profile disputes. Because as more information enters the public space, people don't just absorb it, they reevaluate what they already believe. And in this case, that reevaluation extends beyond the current legal claims. It begins to include past experiences, reputations, and perceived patterns of behavior, even when those elements are not directly tied to the legal proceedings themselves. Which raises an important question moving forward. At what point does added context help clarify a situation? And at what point does it begin to complicate it even further? At the center of this shift is the growing focus on evidence and how it's being interpreted. According to public reports and discussions surrounding the case, Justin Baldoni has presented materials intended to challenge the claims made against him. These reportedly include messages and other documentation that, from his perspective, offer a different version of events. Now, as with any ongoing legal matter, the role of that material is ultimately for the court to evaluate. But in the public space, the presence of detailed counter-evidence often changes how a story is perceived, because it introduces a competing narrative. And once that happens, the conversation typically moves away from what is being alleged to which version of events appears more consistent. This is where Ewood's account becomes relevant again, not as evidence in the legal sense, but as something that some viewers interpret as aligning with one side of the broader narrative. In his own words, the turning point for him came when he reviewed what Baldoni had presented publicly. He describes that as the moment he began to question whether the claims being made fully matched the available information. But that introduces a critical distinction, because public perception and legal determination are not the same thing. What appears convincing in a public discussion doesn't necessarily carry the same weight in a legal setting, where standards of proof and admissibility are far more strict. Still, from a narrative standpoint, this is often the moment where momentum shifts. When one side presents detailed material, and the other side's response is still unfolding, it creates an imbalance in how the story is being consumed, at least temporarily. And that imbalance can influence how additional information, including past accounts, is interpreted. Which brings the situation to a more complex place. Because now it's no longer just about two opposing claims. It's about how multiple layers of information, past and present, are being pieced together in real time. And as these layers continue to build, the conversation starts to move beyond the individuals involved into something broader. Because situations like this don't just raise questions about one case. They raise questions about how credibility is assessed in public. In this instance, you have an ongoing legal dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, where claims and counterclaims are still being examined. At the same time, you have past accounts, like Ewood's, being brought back into the conversation, not as verified conclusions, but as additional context. And when those two things intersect, the focus naturally shifts. From what is being alleged to how people decide what to believe. Part of that comes down to patterns, or at least perceived patterns. If multiple pieces of information appear to align in a certain direction, some viewers begin to treat that as meaningful. Others may see those same pieces as unrelated or insufficient to draw conclusions. And that difference in interpretation is where much of the tension now sits. Because there isn't a final resolution yet. The legal process is still ongoing. The full scope of evidence, responses, and rulings is still developing. And until that process is complete, many of the questions being raised remain open. But what's already clear is that the narrative has expanded. It's no longer confined to a single set of claims. It now includes past experiences, public reactions, and competing interpretations, all unfolding at the same time. Which means the outcome won't just be shaped by what happens in court. It will also be shaped by how these overlapping narratives are understood along the way. At this point, the situation surrounding Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni is no longer just a straightforward legal dispute. It's become a layered narrative, one that now includes past experiences, resurfaced accounts, and evolving public interpretation. The account from a former Gossip Girl crew member doesn't determine the outcome of the case. It doesn't establish legal conclusions, but it does add another perspective, one that some viewers are now factoring into how they view the broader situation. And that's where the complexity remains. Because while the legal process will ultimately focus on evidence, filings, and arguments presented in court, the public conversation operates differently. It absorbs context, compares narratives, and often revisits past events in light of present developments. So the question moving forward isn't just about what will be decided legally. It's also about how these overlapping narratives, past and present, continue to shape perception along the way. And as more information comes out, that perception may continue to shift. Curious to hear your take on this. Do you think past experiences like this should influence how current situations are viewed? Or should they be considered separately? Let me know what you think. And if you want to stay updated as this develops, you can subscribe. I'll continue covering the key updates as they come in.